Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to begin by thanking the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People for convening this event and also its Division for Palestinian Rights. It is a pleasure to be with you once again. It is exceedingly difficult to speak about the Nakba in a manner that sufficiently captures the enormity of the Palestinian predicament, a long-festering wound upon the conscience of these United Nations. Ethnically cleansed, denationalized, dispossessed, occupied, racially discriminated against, and now the target of what the International Court of Justice has determined is a risk of irreparable harm to their right to be protected from genocide. It is as though the Palestinian people have been made to endure an endless Calvary, as Edward Said once put it, incessant, unremitting, unforgiving. As we gather to mark 76 years of Nakba, under the long shadow of Gaza, the theme of continuity is ever present. What the Palestinian people has been enduring for 3/4 of a century, uniquely on full display in real time on social media feeds as we speak, is a singular experience of unmitigated disaster, of the sustained and concerted effort to do away with their collective and national existence in their native land. The Nakba continues because it is the logical culmination of Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine, which has yet to complete its task, with its insatiable desire to displace and replace Palestine's natives, as foretold and proclaimed openly by its founding fathers, institutions, and present-day adherents. As Patrick Wolf has noted, settler colonialism involves, quote, a logic of elimination. This logic strives for the dissolution of native societies while it erects new colonial societies in their place. In this sense, settler colonizers come to stay, with invasion and colonizing constituting, in Wolf's words, a structure, not an event. Your Excellencies, the Nakba is a structure, not an event. This structure is in overdrive as we speak, with a pace and fervor never before seen. It is happening publicly, its authors openly admit its aims, and yet little to nothing is being done to stop it by those in a position to do so. It is being actively colluded in by a small number of Western states and political elites, led by the United States. It has cast doubt, serious doubt, over the continued viability of the post-World War II international legal order. These Western states have fashioned all manner of Orwellian justifications for their collusion with the Nakba in Gaza, whether nonsensical arguments about Israel's so-called right of self-defense, dismissed by the International Court of Justice 20 years ago, or Israel's purported purity of arms, belied by countless TikTok videos of sadistic IDF soldiers on the ground, or acquiescence in spurious Israeli allegations or claims that UNRWA, the life-giving, life-saving humanitarian arm of the United Nations in Gaza, was somehow involved in 7 October, now debunked by a high-level independent review panel, if any was ever needed. The vocious of these Western justifications is rooted in one simple truth that runs like a thread throughout: the consistent denial of the very humanity, agency, and political rights of the Palestinian people, a people for whom the United Nations has a permanent responsibility until their plight is resolved in accordance with international law. The UN's permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine is often spoken of in these hallowed halls, but what is not spoken of as often or at all are the reasons as to why this responsibility actually exists. And for that, it is essential to discuss the fateful decision made by the then Western-dominated United Nations General Assembly to recommend partition of Palestine against the will of the country's indigenous population, the majority population, through Resolution 181 of 29 November 1947. A review of the terms of the partition plan and the accompanying UN record, recounted in my recently published book on the United Nations and the question of Palestine, reveals that the plan was illegal under prevailing international law. This illegality helped lay the groundwork for the Nakba of 1948 and its painfully unjust results that have continued and indeed accelerated ever since remain with us. Your Excellencies, as many of you know, Resolution 181 provided for the partition of Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state in economic union, with the city of Jerusalem and its environs established as a corpus separatum. Both states were required to adopt democratic constitutions, establish government on the basis of universal suffrage, and guarantee to all persons equality before the law. Sounds good, doesn't it? But by any objective assessment, the terms of the partition plan revealed an absolute contempt for the principle of self-determination of peoples as applied to Palestine as a Class A mandated territory, rooted upon the idea, which you will all recognize, of majority democratic rule. Territorially, the plan allotted the Jewish state 57% of Palestine, including its most fertile land, despite the Jewish settler population comprising only 1/3 of the country and possessing only 5.6% of registered land ownership. Demographically, although the proposed Arab state would include a clear majority of approximately 725,000 Arabs to 10,000 Jews, the proposed Jewish state would contain a total population of 1,080,000, consisting of 509,000 Arabs to 499,000 Jews. And this meant that based on the United Nations record, minority rule would prevail in the purported Jewish state from the outset. This, despite the terms of Resolution 181 requiring that the proposed Jewish state be democratic, ensure universal suffrage, and guarantee equality before the law. The UN partition plan was a glaring anomaly under prevailing international law. As I outline in my book, only 2 courses of action were legally open to the Assembly at the time. First, immediate independence of the whole of Palestine, in line, oh shock and horror of it, with the wishes of the majority of its inhabitants. Or 2, second, UN trusteeship. Put simply, if the new UN charter system was to prevail, partition could never be legal without the freely expressed consent of the governed. The UN record demonstrates that partition was not based on these international legal considerations. Rather, it was driven by hegemonic European states and their settler colonial affiliates for political reasons. The UN record shows that the declared goal of these states was to rectify Europe's centuries-old Jewish question in the wake of the Holocaust, and to do so at the expense of the innocent third-party Palestinians. As noted by the permanent representative of Yemen at the time, quote, "If Jews were persecuted in Europe, what have the people of Palestine to do with that?" End quote. The UN record demonstrates that partition was accompanied by a complete contempt for principles of self-determination and democratic governance as applied to Palestine as a Class A mandated territory. For instance, in its majority report recommending partition to the Assembly, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, expressly noted, and I quote, "With regard to the principle of self-determination, although international recognition was extended to this principle at the end of the First World War, and it was adhered to with regard to the other Arab territories at the time of the creation of the A mandates, it was not applied to Palestine, obviously because of the intention to make possible the creation of the Jewish national home there. Actually, it may well be said that the Jewish national home and the sui generis mandate for Palestine run counter to that principle," end quote, run counter to the principle of self-determination. Astoundingly, none of this gave the UNSCOP majority reason for pause. An even more animated rationale in support of partition came from one of UNSCOP's members who unabashedly asserted on the floor of the General Assembly on 10 October 1947, and I quote, "Palestine was no more Arab than certain Spanish countries of Latin America were Indian. The Jews had made a pleasant and healthy country out of a land in which a sparse and rachitic population had merely vegetated. It was incomprehensible that the Arabs should adduce their numerical superiority as an argument. An ignorant majority should not be allowed to impose its will," end quote. An ignorant majority should not be allowed to impose its will, end quote. Your Excellencies, one could go on, but you get the point. For the Western-dominated UN, at the time, of course, the Palestinian people did not matter when it came to the application of international law in 1947. Their claims, let alone their existence, were not taken seriously by the Western powers. Like all colonial peoples, they were treated with racist contempt and as a mere impediment to more noble European interests that were to be pursued, come what may. Why, one might ask, does any of this matter when we speak of the 1948 Nakba and the UN's permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine? Well, the UN record shows that UNSCOP and the Western-dominated General Assembly suffered from a cognitive dissonance as to the inevitability of violence befalling Palestine and its people following the passage of the Partition Plan. We now know from the UN record that the 1948 Nakba consisted of innumerable acts of widespread, premeditated, and systematic violence aimed at expelling or encouraging the mass flight of the indigenous Palestinian population from the country. These acts included the wholesale and indiscriminate bombardment, siege, and expulsion of the Palestinian population from cities, towns, and villages. At least 31 confirmed massacres of Palestinian civilians, including use of mass graves as means of concealment, rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, psychological terror campaigns broadcasting horrors to befall the population if it did not flee, biological warfare, and a host of scorched earth tactics, including the deliberate destruction of between 392 and 418 Palestinian villages, whence at least half the refugees were expelled. And as the ethnic cleansing was unfolding, and well before the last armistice agreement was signed in 1949, the new state of Israel consolidated its conquest, seizing, looting, and settling Palestine refugees and state property. On the eve of the Zionist offensives in April 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister, said, quote, "We shall enter the empty villages and settle in them. In peacetime, we would not have been able to do this," end quote. Accordingly, about 135 new Jewish settlements were established during the 1948 war, most of which on Arab-owned land, including dozens on territory earmarked by the UN Partition Plan for the Palestinian Arab state. Tens of thousands of new Jewish settlers were moved in by Israel into Palestinian refugee houses that remained intact. They and their descendants remain in that property to this day. It is therefore not without reason that when Israeli leaders now call for the resettlement of the Gaza Strip in the heat of battle, the people of Palestine shudder in fear of what is to come. Your Excellencies, Palestine's initial ethnic cleansing in the 1948 Nakba was consolidated by an Israeli cabinet decision of 16 June of that year to bar return of the Palestinian refugees to their property and their homes. And this was followed by various administrative acts, including the blocking of Palestinian refugee bank accounts and the passage of legislation in Israel aimed at giving the imprimatur of legality to it all. Israel's ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian refugees, its wholesale dispossession and usurpation of their property, its mass denationalization of that population, and its denial of the right of those refugees to return and restitution constitute gross and systematic violations of relevant international law, which continue to the present day. For almost 8 decades, they have been compounded by myriad actions of Israel, administrative, legislative, judicial, and now military, all of which have been animated by what Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem has declared is a regime of Jewish supremacy, their words, not mine, between the river and the sea. An apartheid regime, friends. Literally no facet of Palestinian life has been left untouched. Which brings us to the Nakba of today. Even before 7 October, Gaza had been shorn by Israel of anything remotely capable of sustaining a dignified life for one person, let alone 2.3 million. 56 years of illegal Israeli military occupation, compounded by 16 years of Israeli blockade, multiple Israeli military assaults resulting in tens of thousands of casualties, including the killing and maiming of thousands of children. A multi-decade process of de-development and de-industrialization, resulting in a 45% unemployment rate and a 60% poverty rate, with 80% of the population dependent on some form of international assistance. 97% of drinking water unfit for human consumption, and a healthcare system on its last legs for having been suffocated by the blockade. All of that before 7 October. All this to say, and as noted by the Secretary General on 25 October, the events of 7 October did not happen in a vacuum. Since that fateful day, Israel has deployed a level of violence not seen anywhere this century. Total war has descended upon Gaza. According to the United Nations, approximately 35,000 Palestinians have been killed so far, 2/3 of whom women and children, and another 78,000 are injured, many for life. A further 1.7 million, that's almost 80% of the population of the Gaza Strip, have been forcibly displaced with indiscriminate bombardment, yet again, scorched earth tactics and starvation as a tool of war deployed against them. Humanitarian aid is in frighteningly short supply as objects indispensable for the survival of the civilian population continue to be arbitrarily withheld by the occupying power. Life-saving medicines, anesthetics, food, fuel, water, electricity. According to the International Court of Justice, famine is setting in Gaza, and as mentioned, there is a risk of irreparable harm to Palestinian rights to be protected from genocide. Gaza, a place I once called home, is being ground to dust. No place is safe, no home, no hovel, no refugee camp, no hospital, no school, no UN shelter, not in the north, not in the middle, not in the south, nowhere. I've often wondered what I would have done had I lived during the time of the 1948 Nakba. Would I have acted on my conscience to stop the atrocities unfolding before me, or would I have remained silent as much of the world did? It would appear that fate has now ironically presented us all, dear friends, comrades, with such a moment in Gaza. Israeli leaders are now openly boasting that Gaza is, quote, rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Forgive me, that Israel is now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Their soldiers are planting flags in Gaza beaches, vowing to reestablish Israeli colonies there. But the world is watching. In the words of one sitting member of the ICJ, quote, "The alarm has now been sounded by the court. All the indicators of genocidal activities are flashing red in Gaza. An injunction has been served for ending the atrocities. The provisional measures indicated by the court are binding. They are not something that a state party to the convention is free to respect or to ignore according to its own pleasure. They must be implemented," end quote. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the question is, will they be implemented? It is clear that the answer to this has already been furnished by Israel, and that answer is no. Not when the court issued its first provisional measures order on 26 January, nor when it issued its last one on 28 March. Just as international law was trampled on in the 1948 Nakba, so too is it being trampled on in the 2024 Nakba. The historical record is clear. If change is to happen, it must come from elsewhere. And this means you. This means all of us. If the words never again are to mean anything, if these United Nations are to honor the legacy of those for whom those words were initially fashioned, we must summon the courage to apply them at all times and in all places, without fear or favor. If anything is clear, that time and that place is the Gaza ghetto. That time and that place is now. The people of Palestine demand nothing else and nothing less. Our humanity does, too. Thank you.